We begin today with an ambitious and landmark deal, the AUKUS Defence Pact between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. It includes an American and British commitment to supply Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. Those submarines have greater range, endurance and stealth than electric subs. It is the latest step in the American-led Indo-Pacific strategy to counter China, and it will intensify US and British involvement in the region and bind the three countries in unprecedented ways into the 2040s and well beyond. All this has provoked a strong response from China. The Foreign Ministry said the deal was a violation of the aims and objectives of the International Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin described the deal as a dangerous move.
The latest joint communiqué issued by the US, the UK and Australia indicates the three countries have gone further and further down a wrong and dangerous road for their own selfish political gains, in complete disregard of the concerns of the international community.
Here in the UK, the British Defence Minister Tom Tugendhat said the move was a clear statement of intent.
This is a huge commitment to our submarine capability. It's an extremely important and very clear demonstration that the Royal Navy will remain what it always has been, which is a formidable force for good in the world, capable of defending ourselves and our allies and making sure the sea lanes remain open for international trade. That is a hugely important commitment by the United Kingdom government to not just our two allies, Australia and the United States, but to many others around the world.
Lots to chew over. A short time ago, I turned to John Blaxland, who is Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at Australia National University's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre.
This is a momentous step. It is a historic move. It is a major initiative, the scale of which we have not seen in generations. In fact, this is enormous.
Do you have any concerns about it at all? Are there any risks here?
Oh, there's plenty of risks. There's no question there's lots of risks, but with the risks come a spectrum of opportunities. And that's the thing that's driven the three countries clearly on a bipartisan basis. All three countries, it's very interesting to see. Both sides of the aisle in Parliament are recognising that this is a good idea. It's a sensible response to an emerging a challenge, the likes of which we haven't seen before. For Australia, of course, it's very much a response to the fact that we have a very big coastline and diesel-electric submarines are no longer suitable for the task because of persistent surveillance from drones and satellites with artificial intelligence that makes it very easy to detect submarines like that now. So the only way to avoid that is to actually stay submerged, and to do that you need nuclear propulsion. This is about staying in the game for Australia. We've been in submarine business for generations. We don't want to drop out. China would like us to drop out, and that's one of the reasons why they're being so vocal about this, because they clearly are upset that we are going to have a capability that's going to impinge on their freedom of action.
Well, it's not just the Chinese who are objecting to this. Indeed, they're saying that the three countries are engaged in a path of error and danger, but it's also the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, which is raising concerns about the very thing that you've just mentioned, the nuclear fuel that will be used in these nuclear submarines. So their concern is that that could lead to a breaking, or in fact a way of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been in place for many decades, being violated in some way.
Razia, that is just balderdash. It really is. Australia has been very, very clear with the IAEA, and when they've had IAEA people engaged, they've completely understood what Australia's position has been. That is just Chinese talking points. Australia is not threatening the NPT. Australia is adhering to the NPT. The whole design of this concept, the whole point of the way we've designed it, is that it's a black box. It's manufactured not in Australia. It is not disassembled in Australia. The parts are not accessible in Australia. It is not subject to any kind of proliferation. No nuclear weapons grade material will be exposed to the elements in Australia or used by anyone else, the IAEA has been given an opportunity to verify and to be involved in the process of verification. But China knows that, but it is rabble-rousing anyway because it doesn't want this to happen.
Of course China doesn't want it to happen because China sees this as an attempt to contain it, indeed encircle it, which does suggest that while the three countries that have signed up for this defence pact will argue that it is unprecedented and a positive thing for all three countries and indeed for security in that part of the world, the Chinese and, of course, the Russians are arguing that it will bring years of confrontation in Asia. Do you not accept that that is a very real possibility?
Razia, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Let's face it, this would not have been possible had it not been for the last decade of wolf warrior diplomacy and exponential growth of Chinese military, air, naval, sea, space, cyber and strategic missile capabilities that have scared the horses across the neighbourhood. Why is Japan doubling its GDP expenditure on defence? Because it's scared of what China's doing. Why is the Philippines revisiting its alliance with the United States after the previous president effectively walked away from it? Because even when they tried to do a deal with China over the South China Sea, the Chinese couldn't help themselves and kept poking them in the eye. And why is the rest of Southeast Asia cowed? Why is Indonesia kind of reluctant to come out too clearly in support of Australia? They're cowed, but privately they're quite happy. Privately, in many of the discussions of senior officials and pundits like myself have around the region, people quietly say, look, you people in Australia, you're a bit brash, you're a bit loud, we're a bit what you see is what you get. We're not terribly subtle maybe, but we kind of like you because that's what you are. You're not a threat to us and you stand up for yourselves. And China is absolutely squirming about this. It's really so this is kind of like the wolf that's huffing and puffing. Yes, they may well want to impose more sanctions, but look, the last time they imposed $20 billion of sanction, and they still bought more from us than they did before they imposed the sanctions. I mean, really.
You talk about the possibility of more sanctions. I mean, to what extent has the Australian government weighed up how important the trading partnership with China is?
So they don't trade with us because they like our liberal Western democracy. They only do so because it's a good deal, and they will stop doing so when they find somewhere that's more reliable and cheaper. And that's going to take quite some time. Australia doesn't want to drop trade. It wants to continue to trade. And the Prime Minister has assiduously avoided using language that would provoke and stir a reaction, the likes of which his predecessor experienced when he and his senior ministers started using slightly inflammatory language. But when we think about the language that's emanating from Beijing, ours pales by comparison. The wolf warrior language is, I thought President Xi talked about retreating from the wolf warrior rhetoric, was back on in full form. And what is it saying to the rest of the world? This is a regime that is prepared to pull the gloves off and play like this. It's sending a very clear message. Be very careful about what you do when you engage with China.
Now, the interventions by the US and the UK over the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank has not stemmed the response in the markets. Financial markets continue to be gripped. There have been fresh losses in stock markets in the Asia Pacific. Shares in Europe and Asia took a hammering into the collapse of SVB in the US. How are they looking today? A question for Russ Mould, Investment Director at the investment company AJ Bell.
The Asian banks were weak overnight, catching up with heavier, again, falls in the American quoted banks. They were down between 8 and 12% on the main banking indices. Interestingly, European banks started a little bit weak, but had begun to rally. So you look at the big British banks, they're now up between 0 and 3%. The big European, something similar, and even asset-prone Credit Suisse is seeing a small increase in its share price this afternoon as we speak.
And in terms of Europe's major stock markets, dropped between 2 and 4% yesterday on Monday, more settled today. And how does that kind of compare? What does it tell us about the European reaction to something that happened on the west coast of the US?
Yeah. Again, the European markets are now up a little bit. The screens are showing some welcome green. I think what investors are now looking at and markets now thinking is, does the collapse of one bank that took too much risk wasn't terribly well run and managed its balance sheet very badly and was caught out by something that they should have been expecting, which is a higher interest rate. Does that really mean that the entire banking system is at risk? And I think investors are now coming around to the sensible conclusion that the answer is no.
Well, presumably partly also buoyed by President Biden's assurance that regulators would do whatever was needed to protect depositors.
Absolutely correct. And the important thing there, as it is the protection of depositors. Keep them whole. That preserves confidence in the system and means that people don't need to start moving their money between different banks, which could leave other banks in a similar situation to SVB. That's the most important thing. But also, shareholders were not bailed out. So there is a reminder that there are risks associated with stock markets and that therefore this issue of moral hazard, I think, has been kept at bay this time.
And if you are just a regular bank account holder or you have deposits with a bank in Europe, to what extent would any of this be making any impact on you?
That's a really good question. The first 100,000 euros or $105,000 roughly of any account is covered by European national deposit guarantees. That's lower than the American equivalent of $250,000. But in the UK, it's £85,000 sterling. So up to that level, you're completely covered. And clearly there has to be a suspicion somewhere in the background that if there is a major accident, the Europeans may be tempted to follow the American League and offer a blanket guarantee.
Let's look at the intervention by the American Treasury, the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, deciding that they were going to intervene. I mean, in the context of Europe, when do central banks decide when enough is enough?
I think it's generally when they see what they would view as a systemic risk, that there is a domino effect, where if one bank were to topple, then it will knock other ones over. That's why they got involved in 2007 to 9. It's why they even bailed out a hedge fund in New York in 1998 that lost its money on Russian-traded debt. So it's when they think there is a ripple effect that will have a wider impact on banking and therefore the real economy, not just the financial economy, that's when they tend to get involved.
We hear from a Turkish engineer from the United Kingdom who has just arrived in southeastern Turkey to investigate why so many buildings collapsed in the earthquake there last month.
It also is something that's pretty dangerous. We know that there was an asbestos hazard in the area because of all the debris. I actually was under the impression that the debris was being cleared very, very rapidly, which is true in most areas. But today we have arrived to Antakya and, we have been working on this earthquake for a very long time, but nothing can really prepare you to this.
Do stay with us. That interview coming up shortly. The BBC News headlines this hour. Beijing and Moscow have condemned a defence deal between the US, Britain and Australia designed to counter China's growing naval power. A storm that brought flooding and landslides to southern Malawi is now known to have killed 190 people. This is Razia Iqbal with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. It has been 6 weeks since the devastating earthquake that flattened towns in southern Turkey and northern Syria. This week, a UK team of engineers led by the Turkish engineer Dr. Yasemin Didem Aktaş have travelled to the region to join in efforts to inspect the building structures. There were multiple allegations of improper building regulations against the Turkish government in the wake of the disaster, which has killed more than 50,000 people. A short time ago, I spoke to Dr. Aktaş. First, I asked her what she's seeing.
Well, I am currently in the historic city centre of Antakya, and I have driven around the city, and I am literally not seeing a single building that is not damaged. It is a complete war zone here. Yesterday we were in Iskenderun, which was a little bit more of a mixed bag. We have seen standing buildings just fine, collapses, medium damage, etc. But here it's really quite severe.
President Erdogan described the earthquake as part of fate's plan. This was an absolutely extraordinarily massive earthquake. Do you think he was right to suggest that there was only so much a country can do to prepare for an earthquake like the one that Turkey suffered?
This was a massive earthquake, and it was not one earthquake, but a few earthquakes in a row. And the records show that it was extraordinary, really. But, of course, we could have prepared better. We are observing a lot of details on the ground at the moment that actually tell us that a substantial portion of the building stock was not code compliant.
Such as? Give me examples of what you're finding.
First of all, we are understanding this from the modes of failure. So the pancake failure should not happen no matter what. But also from our study of the debris, we are seeing a lot of large and smooth chunks of aggregates in the concrete, which shouldn't be used for concrete, really.
So when you say small aggregates, what are you talking about? Pebbles mixed in with concrete that shouldn't be there?
Yes, exactly. So the source of aggregates should be such that the aggregates can actually hold on to the concrete. So we are normally using a certain shape and size aggregates. However, what we are observing here is telling us that the aggregate wasn't sourced from the right places. When we look into the concrete, it really is quite weak. In often cases, we can actually crumble it with our bare hands, which again shows that the concrete isn't up to standard. Of course, this is not the whole story. Most of the buildings that were damaged are quite old and not very well maintained, etc. And then there are also buildings that actually survived very well.
When you talk about the things that you have already found that suggest to you that standards were not met, you will be aware that there were widespread accusations from the day after the earthquake that buildings weren't properly constructed. Are you already coming to some conclusions that those accusations may have credibility to them?
Yes, absolutely. So if construction quality is as poor as we are observing for certain buildings, then definitely the construction processes might have gone wrong at some point. Whether this is actually at the design stage or in the implementation stage is yet to be cleared. But I can say confidently that there's something wrong.
Does the removal of rubble make it much harder for you to do your job?
Well, yes and no. We can actually look into the details about the concrete quality. However, it also is something that's pretty dangerous. We know that there was an asbestos hazard in the area because of all the debris. I actually was under the impression that the debris was being cleared very, very rapidly, which is true in most areas. But today we have arrived to Antakya, and we have been working on this earthquake for a very long time, but nothing can really prepare you to this.
Are you hopeful that your findings might lead to construction rules being adhered to differently?
I have to be hopeful. This is my job. I have to hope that the outputs, from my work will influence things. I know that my hope is shared, and we are also organizing at the moment a lot of meetings and scientific gatherings so that we can actually have these exchanges with our colleagues. Now we can actually present all our work to the ministries and the municipalities, etc. So yeah, I am hopeful.